The RBA and MMT. Let's have a look. Good morning, everyone. Florian.Heise here, and welcome to another episode of HeiseSays. I hope you're having a good week and you're surviving with the challenges of working from home. Recently had my first ever meeting using Microsoft Teams, and it worked quite well. I've had it sitting there for years and haven't used it. I've got my morning coffee today, and I thought I'd do a video based on a viewer request looking at modern monetary theory, MMT, and tying it into some recent tweaks that the RBA is doing about, or doing towards, or with QE, quantitative easing. So I think these things tie together, and we're going to hear more and more of it discussed. So I thought, well, a viewer asked me to do just a little summary of MMT. I thought, yeah, it's probably something that some people aren't quite familiar with. And, there's some historical precedent that I think we can all draw upon, and some lessons we can learn to theorize of what might happen. So let's have a look first at this article from news.com.au regarding the RBA to assess whether QE needs tweaking. So the Reserve Bank of Australia board will meet on Tuesday today to discuss whether the quantitative easing measures launched a fortnight ago need tweaking. The Reserve Bank board will consider whether its bond buying program needs tweaking and when it holds its first monetary policy meeting since unveiling its historic suite of stimulus measures to combat the impact of the illness pandemic. Now, the RBA is creating currency out of nowhere and using it to buy bonds to help stimulate the economy, to get more money in the economy. Out of nowhere. Board members decided at a March 18th emergency meeting that Australia's economy would likely shrink in the March and June quarters and potentially longer, and therefore the cash rate needed to be cut to a record low of 0.25%. The RBA's first out-of-cycle meeting since 1997 also deployed a range of quantitative easing measures in a bid to cushion the economic pain brought by the illness pandemic. Westpac's economists are among those who do not expect the RBA to touch the cash rate on Tuesday, as board members have already signalled it will likely remain lower bound for some time. And I'll bring up this chart showing you the cash rate. Showing you the cash rate. You can see how low we're sitting there, 0.25%. I mean, it's crazy. It really is quite low. Remember, guys, this is an artificial intervention in the market. This is an artificial intervention in the market. We're not in a free market system here. The RBA is manipulating the free flow of the market. I mean, who in their right mind would well, I guess people are in their right mind accepting low and negative interest rates all over the world just to ensure they get their money back. But as such, the focus of RBA's meetings will be how the board assesses its QE measures and whether they may require adjusting. Westpac said in a note on Monday. For April, do not anticipate this requiring adjustment. The RBA reduced the cash rate to 0.5% at the bank's regular March board meeting and had cut it by 1.25% since June in a bid to stimulate Australia's flagging economy. But the problem is, who's going to borrow money in an environment like this? The government's trying to guarantee our loans. The housing sector, I know the spruikers are saying it's going good and it's a vendor's market apparently, but it just doesn't make any sense. It doesn't align with confidence in the community. If people can't even go out and live their lives, and they're just starting to get stir crazy now. People are just starting to get stir crazy. The widely anticipated March 18 emergency cut meant the central bank also pulled the trigger on its first ever quantitative easing program to boost cash supply and encourage lending and investment. Westpac said the RBA has so far purchased $29 billion worth of 10-year government bonds, while another $2 billion was expected to be bought on Monday afternoon. Now just think about this, guys. What is a government bond? It is future taxation. The government generates the bonds, And in the future, we'll be paying interest for the period of that bond. And where's the RBA get their money to buy these things? Where do they get the money to buy these things? Oh, they type in a keyboard. Oh, sorry, currency. They type in a keyboard. So there you go. We'll be working for that for the next 10 years. For the next 10 years to pay those bonds that they bought. And there'll be more and more and more. The RBA has a target yield on 3-year bonds of about 0.25%. The central bank also created a $90 billion lending facility to banks for small and medium businesses, adding to a $15 billion loan scheme for small and medium lenders that had just been announced by the federal government. The RBA neglected to give an official growth forecast a fortnight ago, but it did tip significant job losses. Well, if you're fans of the channel, you know this is one of my favorite charts. I've put it on a mug. This is showing wage price index forecasts for the RBA. They're masters of managing this economy. I don't know why they're even trying, honestly, to forecast wage growth. The size of the fall in economic activity would depend on the extent of the social distancing requirements and potential lockdowns put in place to contain the virus, minutes from the March 18 meeting said. An increasing number of businesses have shut their doors and laid off staff amid intensifying restrictions to stop people gathering in groups and spread the virus. Tuesday's monetary policy decision will be announced at 2:30 Australian Eastern Standard Time today. So I may do a video on that when that comes out. But there you go. I mean, so they're tweaking it. So they're doing QE. They're creating money out of nowhere. Now, let's have a look. Let's go to one of my favorite websites, the Investopedia. And let's read through just what is modern monetary theory? Because we're going to be hearing about it more and more. And they're advocates for it. Now, one question before we get into all of this. If they're doing it now, why aren't they doing it all the time? Why couldn't you just give money to everyone all the time? I know this is a high school, like a childish question, but bear with me. Why couldn't you just give money to everyone all the time so no one ever has to work and everyone just has all the money they need to buy everything, and then everyone can just buy things and no one would ever have to work? It would be utopia. Just dwell on that. Just dwell on that childish question as we go through this. Okay, remember that. That was a question. Did you dwell on that as a child? Did you think on that as a child? Or did you instinctively know that was stupid as a child? It seemed ludicrous to me as a kid. I remember someone at school asking the question, why don't we just send our old money overseas so they can have it? And I just knew that that's not how it works. It's of no value. So, what is modern monetary theory? Modern monetary theory is a heterodox macroeconomic framework that says monetary sovereign countries like the US, UK, Japan, and Canada are not operationally constrained by revenues when it comes to federal government spending. Okay, now there's a few things in here we need to pull apart. Heterodox essentially means unorthodox. And macroeconomic, this is the school of economics where there's actually two scales to economics. They've got micro, which is the smaller business and inter-people relationships, and macro, which is at a national level. Now, the Austrian school doesn't have any distinction between those two scales. For them, it's just the seamless continuity between the two. But in Keynesian and more conventional economics, even though this is an unconventional theory, there's a rubbing up against the two scales, and it seems quite odd particularly when you're introduced to other theories where it's just seamless from one to the other. It seems primitive. Anyway, so in other words, such governments do not need taxes or borrowing for spending, since they can print as much as they need and are the monopoly issuer of the currency. So I'll just read that again for everyone. This is MMT, guys. This is the theory that is being propagated more and more and is being deployed around the world as we speak. In other words, such governments do not need taxes or borrowing for spending, since they can print as much as they need and are the monopoly issuers of the currency. So there's a few things here. There's one issue here, and this is the monopoly issuers of the currency. Okay, we're in having a single source of the currency that you can use legally. A monopoly issuer, that goes against an actual free market. Because, say, if you had different companies that were issuing their own currency, that's why even the Facebook cryptocurrency could have been very, very interesting if it had got off the ground. But we have it now, actually. We have it in the crypto world, where there's multiple coins and altcoins. And you'll have projects that are reputable, that are actually doing something, or coins that are actually useful. And then their value will be more stable. People will actually invest in them. People will trade them and use them. There's a greater liquidity, greater velocity in those coins. Now, you also have some shit coins that are worthless. So people create just for a scam or a joke, that are completely rubbish. Then they hardly get used, they've got no velocity, and no one trades them. So you can see here that that's the market working by itself, completely unregulated, where there's different coins and different reliabilities. So crypto is an example of a market where it's regulating itself, where the market is showing what has value and what doesn't. Now, in our nations, because the governments have the monopoly authority, they're the only ones that can issue the currency. There's no competition. Here in Australia, we had a thing, I think, barter card, where you used to, you could use their barter points to trade with other businesses. Intentionally, I think it was a way to get around the ATO back in the day. But then the ATO said, nope, sorry, that's equal to $1 Australian dollar. So your barter dollars are worth less than the Australian dollar because they're not as liquid. You can't spend them as many places, but they consider them equal to $1. So you're kind of shooting yourself in the foot. But that shows you attempts of trying to break that monopoly. Because if you had several different sources for different currencies, and you say, okay, you know what, I'm gonna just use that Facebook token for my business. I'll offer people a discount because it's more stable. Or, I will accept Gold Pass tokens because I know that's backed by gold rather than Australian dollars because it's going to be more stable. These are some options that you could do in business in multiple currencies. You could pick and choose what you want. But the problem is we've got a single source supplier, and that's the problem with any monopoly. So let's keep looking at this. MMT challenges conventional beliefs about the way government interacts with the economy, the nature of money, and the use of taxes and the importance of budget deficits. These beliefs, supporters say, are hangovers from the gold standard era and are no longer accurate, useful, or necessary. Okay. Just remember that. Government doesn't need taxes or borrowing to spend. They can just print as much money as they need. Does that fill you with confidence? Because they've got the control over it. MMT, it's like, well, I will go back to the crypto. For the crypto people out there, if you were investing in a token and they could just keep generating it, would you be worried? Are you worried that the government can just keep generating more and more of your money? Because that will reduce the value of each individual note, the purchasing power of each individual note. MMT is used in policy debates to argue for more progressive legislation like universal healthcare and other expensive public programs for which government claims to not have enough money for. So you just print more money. So the core principles. The central idea of MMT is that governments with a fiat currency system can and should print or create, with a few keystrokes in today's digital age, as much money as they need to spend because they cannot go broke or be insolvent unless a political decision to do so is taken. Because this has happened before, historically, and it hasn't ended well. Traditional thinking says such spending would be fiscally irresponsible as the debt will balloon and inflation would skyrocket. But according to MMT, a large government debt isn't the precursor to collapse we have been led to believe it is. Countries like the US can sustain much greater deficits without cause for concern, and in fact a small deficit or surplus can be extremely harmful and cause a recession, since deficit spending is what builds people's savings. Okay, so the government deficit is what builds your savings, everyone. MMT theorists explain that the national debt is simply money the government put into the economy and didn't tax back. They also argue that comparing a government's budget to that of an average household is a mistake. Because it is in some ways, because an average household doesn't have the ability to create currency out of thin air. We have to work for our currency. And remember, this currency that's created out of thin air using QE, that's used to buy government bonds, will require the government to pay on those bonds. They'll have to pay every month or quarter, or whatever period the bond is paying. And where do they get that money from? They don't print it out of nowhere, do they? Even though they're saying they don't need taxes, they need taxes to pay for the bonds. And who pays the taxes? Who pays the taxes? I wonder. Oh, wait a minute. It's the people. It's the people. It's a brilliant system they got set up here. Brilliant system. What would you prefer? This or, serfdom? Guys. Just think how much of our wages go in taxes. It's depressing when you actually look at it. It really is. All the taxes, fees, and charges the state charges you. Anyway, while supporters of the theory acknowledge that inflation is theoretically a possible outcome from such spending, they say it is highly unlikely and can be fought with policy decisions in the future if required. They often cite the example of Japan, which has a much higher public debt than the US. Okay, Japan, their economy has pretty much just been in zombie mode for decades now. They've got a whole wealth of issues in Japan. The biggest one is their birth rate decline. They're not having enough kids. It's a lot of problems in Japan. I don't think they need to be held up as a poster child for economic management. And compared to Australia, their economy is a little bit more complex. I will bring up the Observatory of Economic Complexity. And let's have a look at Australia. Here we are. We're 59th in the world. Our complexity rating is 0.09. Let's look up Japan. Let's look up Japan, guys. Their complexity rating, first in the world, 2.31. Look at what they're exporting, integrated circuits. Because people in the comments are saying, Australians, we can build everything we need. No, we can't. Can you get a silicon chip built in Australia? Can you get an integrated circuit built in Australia? All these manufacturers that are saying Australian made, all the components are still coming from overseas, like all the chips, all the circuits. Cars, 15%. And look at what they're importing. Crude petroleum, broadcasting equipment. I mean, there you go. There you go. What we'll do is I will bring up Australia as well, everyone. We'll just compare. So we're 59th in the world. Iron ore is our largest export. What's Japan's? Japan's largest export was cars. What do you think's more complicated? Iron ore or cars? So it's something to think about, guys. I'm sure the US can compare to Japan. We'll look up. Let's look up the US. Let's see where they sit. So this is the thing, when they're making these examples, you need to look at what they're comparing. They're 7th in the world. What's the US biggest export? Refined petroleum. There you go. Look at all the stuff. Just look at Australia, guys. So when they're making all these claims and talking about these examples, you just need to remember that we're not all the same, guys. We're not all the same. I know the SJWs want everyone to be equal. Das Vidania, comrade. It's not going to happen. So according to MMT, the only limit the government has when it comes to spending is the availability of real resources, like workers, construction suppliers. When government spending is too great with respect to the resources available, inflation can surge if decision makers are not careful. Well, both of these things are going to decline here in Australia right now. Workers due to this illness, and construction supplies because a lot of it is imported. A lot of it is imported. So how are our decision makers going to be careful to not get us surging inflation? Taxes create an ongoing demand for currency and are a tool to take money out of an economy that is getting overheated, MMT says. So, okay, so if the economy is overheating and inflation is going up, they'll just tax us more. Is that how you manage it? This goes against the conventional idea that taxes are primarily meant to provide the government with money to spend to build infrastructure, fund social programs, etc. So it's you got to think about this. Their argument is taxes are there just to, and in a roundabout way, this makes sense. It's quite perverse. Taxes are there to slow down the economy, to stop it from overheating. They don't need it to fund all these crazy things because they can just print the money out of nowhere. So it's like they're chasing their own tail. It's going to be an endless adjustment process of high taxation, low taxation, printing money, going on forever and ever and ever, because all the data they have will be outdated. So what happens if you were to go to your local IRS office to pay your taxes with actual cash? Wrote MMT pioneer Warren Russell in his book, The 7 Deadly Frauds of Economic Policy. First, you would hand over your pile of cash to the person on duty as payment. Next, he'd count it, give you a receipt, and hopefully a thank you for helping to pay for Social Security, interest on the national debt, the Iraq War, etc. Then, after you, the taxpayer, leave the room, he'd take the hard-earned cash you just forked over and throw it in a shredder. MMT says that a government doesn't need to sell bonds to borrow. Since that is money it can create on its own, then why is our government selling bonds to borrow, guys? The government sells bonds to drain excess reserves and hit its overnight interest rate target. Thus, the existence of bonds, which Mulser calls savings accounts at the Fed, is not a requirement for the government, but a policy choice. Unemployment is the result of a government spending too little while collecting taxes, according to MMT. It said those looking for work and unable to find a job in the private sector should be given minimum wage, transition jobs funded by the government and managed by the local community. This labour would act as a buffer stock in order to help the government control inflation in the economy. So, what does this all sound like? What does this all sound like? What does it seem familiar? A centrally planned economy, jobs for everyone as a buffer, printing money when you need it. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, everyone. MMT was developed by American economist Warren Mosler and bears similarities to the older schools of thought like functional finance and chartalism. Mosler first began thinking about some of the concepts that formed the theory in the 1970s when he worked as a Wall Street trader. He eventually used his ideas to place some smart bets at the hedge fund he founded. In the early 1990s, when investors were afraid Italy would default, Mosler understood that wasn't a possibility. His firm and his clients became the largest holder of Italian lira-denominated bonds outside of Italy. Italy did not default, and they made $100 million in profit. Mosler, who has a BA in economics from the University of Connecticut, was largely ignored by the academic world when he tried to communicate his theories. In 1993, he published a seminal essay called Soft Currency Economics and shared it on a post-Keynesian listserv. Wow, that's old. Which is where he found others like Australian economist Bill Mitchell, who agreed with him. Support for MMT grew in large part thanks to the internet, where economists explained the theory on popular personal and group blogs. the idea of a $1 trillion coin was widely discussed, and supporters shared a clip of former Fed Chairman Alan Greenspan saying pay-as-you-go benefits aren't insecure because there's nothing to prevent the federal government from creating as much money as it wants and paying it to somebody. Political leaders like AOZ, I mean, come on, she's a joke, but still, and Bernie Sanders, I mean, here you go. Just look at the people who are arguing for this theory, everyone. Have espoused MMT, and economist Stephanie Kelton, who first came across Molster's ideas on the listserv and is now arguably the face of the theory, serves as a senior economic advisor to Sanders. Well, I wonder if she still does. Worldwide Google search interest in the term peaked in March 2019. Deutsche Bank, in September 2019 report on global debt, wrote that helicopter money, MMT-type policies, and fiscal expansion are what is needed in Europe. This was after the ECB chief, Mario Draghi, said the central bank's governing council should look at untested ideas like MMT, but maintain that it's a government decision and typically a fiscal task. So let's look at some criticisms of MMT. What do you think, guys? Are you a fan of the theories that they're putting forward here? Does it sound like a dressed-up form of money printing and essentially manipulating a lot of the people and enslaving us to increased taxation to manage the economy? Think about that. Using taxation to manage an overheating economy because you can just print money out of nowhere. Does that fill your confidence in the currency that you're using? Criticism of MMT. MMT has been called naive and irresponsible by critics. American economist Thomas Paley has said its appeal lies in it being a policy polemic for depressed times. He has criticized various elements of the theory, like the suggestion that central bank interest rates be maintained at zero, and said it provides no guidance to countries like Mexico and Brazil, and does not take into account political complications arising from vested interests. Nobel Prize-winning economist Paul Krugman's views on US debt are similar to many MMT theorists, but Krugman has been strongly opposed to the theory. In a New York Times op-ed in 2011, he warned the US would see hyperinflation if it were to put into practice, and investors refused to buy US bonds. Do the maths, and it becomes clear that any attempt to extract too much from Zinnigrage and more from a few percent of GDP probable leads to an infinite upward spiral in inflation, he wrote. In effect, the currency is destroyed. This would not happen even with the same deficit if the government can still sell bonds. Michael R. Strain, resident scholar of the American Enterprise Institute, has argued that MMT's proposal that taxes can be used to reduce inflation is also flawed. Raising taxes would only make a downturn worse, increasing unemployment and further slowing the economy, he said in a Bloomberg column. So, I mean, this seems to make a lot of sense, because what does raising taxes do? What do you think about this theory, guys? The government should just print as much money as it can to fund everything it needs and use taxes to manage the economy, because it doesn't really need your money. Bonds, it's just a policy decision. They'll just tax you to manage the economy. What do you reckon, guys? Does this sound like a good idea? Does it sound that it's leading even more and more to a centrally managed economy? We're not in a free market, everyone. Everyone who's blaming the current issues on capitalism, we are not in a completely free capitalistic economy. Not by any measure. Not by any measure. Now, I thought I'd bring up some images here. And this is from the Weimar Republic in Germany. Now, after Germany lost World War I, the monarchy disappeared, the republic came into place, and to pay their war reparations, they printed money. And they printed money. They printed so much money that it started being used as wallpaper. And we can have a look here. This is from 1918 to 23, the value of one gold mark in paper marks. So the mark used to be backed by gold, and this is the idea of currency that was backed by precious metals. Because here I have, 1 kilo of silver. It feels different when you hold a metal in your hands to when you hold paper or plastic money in your hands. So it just shows you how, if you had a board, or even if you had kept a gold-backed mark back then, even though they lost their ability to claim it for gold, or if you changed it for gold, look at the value of that. But you can imagine the purchasing power of your marks. I mean, they were worthless because they just printed money to pay their debts. So, historically, this has never worked out. Never worked out in the past. What do you think about it, guys? Does it sound fair? Does it sound reasonable? Does it seem just a little underhanded to you all? Do you like the idea of the government using taxes to manage the economy? Or would you rather your government didn't go down this messy socialistic path, centrally planning all aspects of the economy and having an actual monetary system that's based on a currency that is tied to something of actual value, so they couldn't overspend? So the government has to make those tough decisions. Because one of the problems with MMT, and we're seeing it right here, rather than letting businesses get destroyed and new growth emerge out of the creative destruction that's necessary in an economy, they are just propping up these zombies forever. And they're enslaving future generations with taxes and bond payments to ensure that can happen. Does that seem fair to you guys? It doesn't seem fair to me. And it looks like Australia is heading down this path. So let me know your thoughts and opinions in the comments below. Are you a fan of MMT? Do you think it's going to work? Or what would you rather? Take care, guys. Thank you all for watching. Please like, share, and subscribe to the channel. If you're a fan and you want to help me produce more content, there are a few ways you can. You can support the channel via YouTube or Patreon, joining for a small monthly fee. You can use our affiliate links at Amazon or eBay for your consumer purchases. You can also use our referral links at Independent Reserve or Kucoin for the crypto traders out there. We have the ability for you to buy our merch from Teespring or from our own blog. You can see the pocket squares behind me. We can take Gold Pass donations if you want to donate gold to us, real currency, or PayPal if you want to support us that way. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day, and I'll see you in the next video.